When the glass of red wine hit the top of my head and slid slowly down my face, I didn't cry. I didn't even blink. I just stood there, in the middle of a glittering private ballroom full of people I didn't know, while my daughter-in-law, Vanessa, smiled coldly and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "You don't belong here." There was a pause, just a heartbeat of silence, before the room erupted in laughter. A few people covered their mouths to hide it. Others didn't bother. Even the waiter froze mid-step, unsure whether to help me or pretend he hadn't seen anything. I could feel the wine soaking through my hair, dripping onto the second-hand dress I'd spent weeks altering myself. It had taken me all night to finish, a soft blue fabric, simple but elegant, because I wanted to look nice for David's in-laws. I wanted them to see that I was trying, but in Vanessa's world, kindness was weakness, and simplicity was a stain. "Let's clean you up," she added, with that poisonous sweetness she wore like perfume. "We wouldn't want you staining the carpet." People laughed harder this time. I picked up my purse from the chair, careful not to meet anyone's eyes. My son David was across the room, staring at me with wide, helpless eyes, but he didn't move. Vanessa's hand was on his arm, nails digging in, and he stayed right where he was. That hurt more than the wine. I walked out without a word. My shoes left wet footprints across the marble floor, and the sound of laughter followed me all the way to the elevator. Outside, the night air hit my skin like a slap. I stood there on the sidewalk, trembling, humiliated, and more alone than I had ever felt in my life. Vanessa had always been cruel in small, subtle ways, backhanded compliments, silent exclusions, forgetting to invite me to dinners. But this was different. This was public. This was deliberate. And this was the moment I understood something I had refused to admit for years. Vanessa didn't just dislike me. She wanted to erase me. And David, my sweet boy, my only child, was too afraid to stop her. That night, I sat awake until dawn, replaying every second of that dinner over and over in my mind. I had spent my entire life sacrificing for my family, working 2 jobs to put David through college, selling my jewelry to help him pay for his first apartment, giving him everything I had. And for what? To be treated like garbage by the woman he chose? The humiliation burned, but underneath it, something else began to stir, something I hadn't felt in a long time: resolve. If Vanessa wanted me gone, she was going to regret trying, because I was done playing the polite, invisible mother-in-law. From that night forward, I wasn't going to cry or beg. I was going to take back my dignity. And when I was done, Vanessa would wish she had never poured that glass of wine. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories coming soon. I wasn't always the woman who walked away from a room full of laughter with her head held high. For most of my life, I was simply Mom. The quiet, steady presence behind everyone else's story. My name is Grace Holloway, and for 68 years, I've prided myself on living a simple, honest life. I grew up in a small town, the kind where neighbors looked out for each other and nothing ever changed. I married Simon, my high school sweetheart, when I was 22. We didn't have much, but we had love. And for me, that was everything. Together, we built a modest life. He worked at the post office, and I taught literature at the local high school. Money was tight, but we always managed. Our greatest joy came the day our son David was born. From the moment I held him, I knew my purpose. I poured everything I had into that boy. Every dollar, every ounce of strength, every dream I once had for myself. I gave it all to him. Simon passed away when David was 19, just before he left for university. Losing my husband was the hardest chapter of my life, but it only strengthened my resolve. I wanted David to have the opportunities we never did. So I worked overtime, tutored on weekends, and even sold my late husband's old watch to help with tuition. And David thrived. He graduated top of his class, built a career in software engineering, and eventually moved to the city. I thought all the sacrifices were worth it, that one day we'd share the kind of closeness I'd always dreamed of between a mother and son. But life had other plans. The change didn't happen overnight. It crept in slowly, first as distance, then indifference. And finally, it arrived in the form of a woman named Vanessa, who would turn my son's heart and my entire world upside down. I still remember the first time I met Vanessa, though met isn't really the right word. It felt more like an interview I hadn't prepared for. David had called me out of the blue one afternoon, his voice bubbling with excitement. "Mom," he said, "there's someone I want you to meet. She's special." I had waited years to hear those words. After Simon died, David had thrown himself into work. Dating seemed like an afterthought. So when he told me he'd finally found someone, I made his favorite lemon cake and spent the afternoon polishing the silver tea set Simon's mother had given us as a wedding gift. I wanted everything to be perfect. When the doorbell rang, David walked in, grinning ear to ear. Beside him was a woman who looked like she had stepped out of a fashion magazine. Long dark hair, designer handbag, sunglasses still perched on her head, even inside. "Mom, this is Vanessa," David said, beaming. She gave me a polite nod, not a smile. "Hello, Mrs. Holloway." "It's Grace, dear," I said, extending my hand. She hesitated before taking it, as though she were afraid to touch something dirty. We sat down for tea, but from the moment Vanessa crossed my threshold, she seemed uncomfortable. Her eyes darted around my modest living room, lingering a little too long on the crocheted doilies, the faded photographs on the mantel, the second-hand sofa I'd reupholstered myself. "It's cozy," she said finally, in the same tone someone might use to describe a stray cat. I laughed it off, but my heart sank a little. By the time they left, I knew two things. Vanessa didn't like me, and she didn't approve of the life I had built. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that this was just the beginning. After that first meeting, I told myself I was overreacting. Vanessa was probably just nervous, I reasoned. Meeting a boyfriend's mother can't be easy, especially when that boyfriend is an only child. But weeks turned into months, and my attempts to grow close to her were met with the same icy politeness every single time. David and I used to talk every evening. He'd call to tell me about work or ask about my garden, or just to hear my voice. After Vanessa came into his life, those calls grew shorter, and then stopped altogether. "I'm busy, Mom," he'd say when I tried to reach him. "We're traveling." Or, "Vanessa's family is in town. We'll talk later." At first, I didn't mind. That's what love does to people. They build new lives and create new priorities. But it was the subtle changes that cut the deepest. He stopped visiting on Sundays, something we'd done religiously since he was a teenager. When he did come by, Vanessa always tagged along, and she never let us speak alone for more than a few minutes. The first Christmas they spent together, I invited them over for dinner. I spent 3 days preparing David's favorite dishes: roast, chicken with thyme, scalloped potatoes, and the lemon cake he always requested for dessert. But 2 hours before dinner, he called. "Mom, we can't make it. Vanessa's parents invited us to their holiday gala. We'll stop by for a quick coffee tomorrow." They came the next afternoon, already dressed for another event. Vanessa brought a bottle of wine as a hostess gift, but didn't touch the food I'd made. She spent most of the visit on her phone. When they left, the house felt emptier than it had in years. It wasn't just distance anymore. Vanessa was pulling David into a world where I didn't fit. A world where homemade meals, secondhand furniture, and modest living were something to be ashamed of. And worst of all, my son didn't even seem to notice. The first time Vanessa openly humiliated me wasn't with a glass of wine. That came later. It happened on a warm spring afternoon at David's promotion celebration. He had just been named senior project lead at his firm, and Vanessa insisted on hosting a lavish garden party at their new house. I arrived early with a homemade lemon tart, the same one David had loved since childhood. It wasn't fancy, but I thought it might bring a little piece of home to his big day. Vanessa greeted me at the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, you brought dessert," she said, taking the dish as though it were a biohazard. "How quaint." I pretended not to notice the wrinkle of her nose as she handed the tart to the caterer and whispered something under her breath. Moments. Later, I saw it quietly placed behind the other desserts on a far corner of the buffet, where no one would ever see it. As the afternoon wore on, Vanessa flitted around the garden like a queen, introducing her friends and family, lawyers, investors, executives. Every time she introduced me, her words stung a little more. "This is David's mom," she'd say with a laugh. "She used to teach English at a public school. Isn't that adorable? Public school. As if it were a failing." But the moment that broke me came later, during the toast. Vanessa clinked her champagne glass and raised it high. "To my brilliant husband, the hardest working man I know. He's achieved all this on his own, through grit and ambition." There was applause. People cheered. And I stood there silently, the woman who had worked 2 jobs so he could study, erased from the story entirely. I told myself it was pride talking. I told myself it didn't matter. But deep down, something inside me cracked that day. Vanessa wasn't just trying to push me out. She was rewriting my place in my own son's life. David's 35th birthday was supposed to be a celebration, a rare chance for us to be together as a family. I spent weeks planning his gift, an old leather-bound copy of the Odyssey I'd saved for, because he'd loved the story as a boy. I even made a slideshow of childhood photos, thinking it might remind him, and Vanessa, that we had a history worth honoring. But the moment I arrived at their home, I realized I was out of place. The event wasn't a birthday party. It was a spectacle. A rented event space, a string quartet, champagne towers, and a guest list full of people I didn't recognize. Everyone was dressed in cocktail attire. I wore my best navy dress, simple, modest, and immediately felt invisible. "Mother-in-law's here," Vanessa announced loudly when I walked in, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "How nice of you to make the trip from the suburbs." Laughter followed. I forced a smile and handed David the wrapped book. He took it politely, but Vanessa grabbed it before he could open it. "A book?" she said, voice pitched so everyone could hear. "How vintage. We got him a new Tesla, but I'm sure he'll treasure this classic literature just as much." The room erupted in laughter again, polite for them, humiliating for me. I excused myself to the restroom to collect myself, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My hands trembled as I dabbed at the tears I refused to let fall. Later that night, Vanessa approached me by the buffet table. "Grace," she said with a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I know you mean well, but maybe next year you can skip the sentimental gifts. David's in a different league now." Different league. Those 2 words echoed in my mind long after the party ended. It was the moment I stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding. Vanessa didn't just dislike me. She wanted to humiliate me, diminish me, erase me completely. And worse, David still said nothing. A few weeks after the birthday party, David called and invited me to dinner at their house. "Vanessa wants to make peace," he said gently. "She feels bad about how things have been." I didn't believe it, not really, but hope is a stubborn thing. I spent the whole day baking his favorite apple pie and rehearsing the words I'd been meaning to say. How much I missed him. How much I wanted to be part of his life again. Maybe, just maybe, this was a chance to start over. When I arrived, the table was already set. Candlelight, crystal glasses, a meal that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Vanessa greeted me with a smile that was too wide, too polished. "Grace," she said smoothly, "so glad you could join us." For the first hour, everything seemed normal. We talked about David's work, about the new apartment they were considering buying, about a trip they were planning to Italy. I let myself believe, just for a moment, that the walls between us might finally come down. Then, while clearing the dishes, I heard them in the kitchen. "They must have thought I was still seated at the table. She's too attached," Vanessa hissed. "It's pathetic. At her age, she should be thinking about retirement homes, not inserting herself into our lives." "Vanessa." David's voice was hesitant. "She's my mother." "She's our problem," Vanessa snapped. "And problems need solutions. Do you really want her hovering around when we have kids?" Can you imagine her in our penthouse? With her manners? Her clothes? My heart thudded in my chest. Every word landed like a blow. Maybe we can suggest she sell the house, Vanessa continued. With that money, we could get her into a senior living community. Nice. Quiet, far away, I stood there frozen, my apple pie still in my hands, realizing that what I'd mistaken for awkward tension had been contempt all along. Vanessa wasn't trying to include me. She was trying to remove me. And David? He didn't argue. He didn't defend me. He stayed silent. After that dinner, I stopped calling David as often. I stopped baking pies and sending birthday cards. I even stopped walking past their apartment on my way to the grocery store, because every glimpse of their world reminded me that I wasn't welcome in it. Weeks turned into months. My life grew quieter, lonelier, and just when I had started to accept the distance between us, an envelope arrived in the mail. Thick, cream-colored paper with gold-embossed letters. The Carnegie Holloway Family Dinner, a celebration of success and new beginnings. Inside was a handwritten note from David. Please come. Mom, it would mean a lot to me. For a long time, I stared at that note. I knew what family dinner really meant. It was Vanessa's stage, her spotlight. I could already picture the expensive wine, the carefully curated guest list, the designer dresses. And I could already hear the condescending comments, the subtle digs, the humiliating jokes at my expense. Part of me wanted to tear up the invitation and pretend it never arrived. But another part, the stubborn part that still hoped for reconciliation, whispered, "What if this time is different?" I bought a new dress, nothing extravagant, but elegant enough that I wouldn't feel out of place. I even had my hair done at a small salon downtown. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel excited. Maybe this was David's olive branch. Maybe he was finally standing up for me. The night of the dinner, I arrived 15 minutes early. The moment Vanessa saw me, her lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh," she said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "You came, how brave." I should have turned around and left right then, but I didn't, because deep down, I needed to see once and for all whether there was still a place for me in my son's life. What I didn't know was that this family dinner would become the night that changed everything. From the moment I stepped through the towering glass doors of the upscale restaurant Vanessa had rented out, I felt like I had walked into a stage production where everyone had a part, except me. Glittering chandeliers sparkled above tables set with gold-trimmed china. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Servers in pressed white shirts floated between guests carrying trays of champagne and caviar. And then there was me, Grace Holloway, in my neatly pressed floral dress, holding a small bouquet of lilies I had brought for Vanessa as a peace offering. She accepted them with 2 fingers and handed them off to a waiter without a word. "Everyone," she announced as she swept me into the center of the room. "This is David's mother. Isn't she adorable? She insisted on joining us tonight." A ripple of laughter followed. I felt my face flush, but I kept my smile steady. I'd spent most of my life in rooms where I didn't quite fit. Church fundraisers, PTA meetings, scholarship galas. I could endure one more evening for my son. Throughout dinner, Vanessa played hostess like a seasoned actress, weaving stories about her family's business successes and their latest European vacation. When she introduced her parents, they looked me up and down and offered tight, polite smiles. "So, Grace," Vanessa's father said, swirling his wine, "David tells us you're retired. How does one fill the days without work?" "I read, I garden, I volunteer at the library," I replied softly. "How quaint," he murmured, returning to his conversation before I finished speaking. By the time dessert was served, I'd been talked over, ignored, and reduced to a background prop. But I stayed. For David. Because somewhere beneath Vanessa's glittering cruelty, he was still my son. What I didn't know was that this evening, this humiliating pageant, was about to culminate in the cruelest moment of all. A moment so public and deliberate it would change everything between us. By the time the waiters cleared the dinner plates, I had rehearsed my exit a dozen times in my head. I'd smile politely, thank them for the evening, and slip out quietly before the humiliation could cut any deeper. But just as I reached for my purse, Vanessa clinked her glass and rose from her chair. "Before dessert," she announced, "I'd like to propose a toast. Tonight isn't just a celebration of David's success, it's a celebration of family." The irony of her words didn't escape me. "Family," she continued, her eyes sweeping over the guests, "is about shared values, about surrounding yourself with people who reflect who you are, where you're going, and who belong by your side." There was something about the way she emphasized that last word, belong, that made my stomach knot. "Some of us," she added, raising her glass toward David, "come from humble beginnings, and that's fine. But life is about growth, isn't it? About moving beyond the past, even if it means leaving certain things, and people, behind." Polite laughter rippled through the room. I felt David's eyes flicker toward me for the briefest second, but he said nothing. "Here's to new chapters," Vanessa finished, her voice bright and clear. "To building a family we can be proud of." Glasses clinked. Smiles flashed. And I sat frozen in my chair, every word like a dagger. In that moment, I realized this wasn't just about disliking me. Vanessa wasn't satisfied with sidelining me. She wanted to erase me completely, to rewrite the story of my son's life without me in it. But something shifted inside me too. Beneath the humiliation and the ache, a tiny ember of defiance sparked to life. I had spent my whole life sacrificing, loving, and giving. And now, I was being discarded like I didn't matter. But Vanessa was about to learn something she had never understood. I did belong, and I wasn't going to disappear. Quietly, dessert had just been served, little glasses of tiramisu and a tower of macarons that looked too perfect to eat, when Vanessa rose from her chair with a glass of deep red wine in hand. Her smile was as polished as ever, but I could see something sharper behind it. Something that made my stomach clench. "Before we end this beautiful evening," she said, voice dripping with charm, "I think we should have one last toast to new beginnings." The guests lifted their glasses obediently. I hesitated. Something in her tone told me this wasn't about a toast at all. Vanessa walked slowly around the table, circling like a predator sizing up its prey. And then she stopped, directly behind me. "Some people," she continued, her voice growing louder now, "struggle to accept change. They cling to the past. They insert themselves where they're not needed. They forget that sometimes the best thing they can do is step aside." There was a pause. A chill swept through the room, and then, before I could even process what was happening, the glass tipped, cold, sticky wine poured over my head, sliding down my hair, staining my dress, soaking into the seat beneath me. Gasps erupted around the table, followed by laughter. Real ugly laughter. Vanessa's lips curled into a triumphant sneer. "Oh dear," she said sweetly. "I must have slipped. How clumsy of me. But then again," she leaned closer, "maybe you just don't belong here." The room roared. My hands shook. My vision blurred. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. David's chair scraped against the floor, but he didn't come to me. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, frozen, as the woman he loved publicly humiliated his mother. I rose without a sound. Every eye followed me as I walked toward the exit, wine dripping from my fingertips. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. But as I pushed open those heavy doors and stepped into the night, one thought burned hotter than my humiliation. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of my reckoning. I don't remember how long I walked that night. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red through my tears, and the cool air clung to my damp hair like a cruel reminder of what had happened. Somewhere along the way, my shoes began to pinch, but I didn't care. Pain was irrelevant. Humiliation was far worse. When I finally reached my little house on Maple Street, I sat at the kitchen table without turning on the lights. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stared at my trembling hands and replayed the scene again and again. Vanessa's voice dripping with venom. David's silence, the laughter ringing in my ears, for hours. I asked myself the same questions over and over. How did it come to this? How did the boy I raised with love and sacrifice become a man who would let this happen? And most painfully, was I truly so worthless in his eyes? But sometime around dawn, something inside me shifted. I looked at the empty coffee mug in front of me, at the framed photo of David on his graduation day, and I made a promise, not just to myself, but to the woman in that photo who had given everything for her child. I would not be erased. I would not be humiliated into disappearing. And I would never let Vanessa win. The days that followed were different. I stopped calling David. I stopped waiting for apologies that would never come. Instead, I began taking inventory of my life, my resources, and the quiet power I had never realized I possessed. I dug out old documents, the deed to the house, the small inheritance Simon had left me, the trust fund I'd set aside for David years ago. I visited my attorney, Ms. Lila Whitmore, for the first time in decades. And I started asking questions, legal questions, financial questions, questions about what I was truly entitled to. I had been playing the part of the meek, grateful mother-in-law for far too long. Now, I was going to become something else entirely, a woman with a plan. The first step of my plan was simple: learn everything I could about the woman who had turned my son against me. I started with public records. Vanessa Carnegie had built an image of wealth and sophistication, expensive clothes, designer handbags, glamorous vacations, but beneath that glossy exterior, there were cracks. Several of the luxury cars she flaunted were leased, not owned. The penthouse she bragged about wasn't in their name, but rented under her parents' company. And the family investments she constantly referenced? Most were deeply in debt. The deeper I dug, the clearer the picture became. Vanessa wasn't a wealthy heiress. She was a woman desperate to appear wealthy, and she'd married my son to keep the illusion alive. I wasn't done. I scheduled a quiet meeting with Lila Whitmore, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney I hadn't spoken to in years. She'd helped Simon and me draft our will decades ago. Now, she listened carefully as I explained everything, from the subtle insults to the wine-soaked humiliation. "Grace," she said, adjusting her glasses, "I'm going to be blunt. You have more power here than you think. Your home, your savings, even the trust fund you set aside for David, those are your assets. If they think they can pressure you into giving them up, they're in for a rude awakening." That conversation lit a spark. For years, I had believed that love meant giving everything without question. But love, I was learning, should never require you to sacrifice your dignity. I began documenting everything. Every insult, every lie, every cruel remark Vanessa had made in public. I reached out to a few old friends who had witnessed her behavior over the years and asked if they'd be willing to give statements. They agreed without hesitation. Piece by piece, I was building a foundation, not just for revenge, but for justice. Vanessa had spent years underestimating me. She believed I was powerless, irrelevant, and easily silenced. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. The more I learned, the more I realized something vital. Vanessa's power over me existed only because I had allowed it. She thrived on my silence, on my politeness, on my desperate hope that David would one day step in and fix things. But that night at the lawyer's office, Lila said something that burned into my memory. "The moment you stop needing their approval, Grace, you become unstoppable." And so, I stopped. The first move I made was quiet but decisive. For years, I had planned to leave my house, savings, and the small trust Simon and I built for David. It was my final gift to him, a safety net for his future. But Vanessa's cruelty had shown me something. If those assets stayed as they were, they'd end up in her hands. With Lila's help, I amended my will. Everything, the house, the trust, the remaining life insurance, would go into a charitable foundation in my name. The foundation's mission would be simple: support single mothers and elderly women abandoned by their families. David would still have access to a modest portion, but only if he fulfilled one specific condition. He had to reconcile with me without coercion and without Vanessa's involvement. It wasn't about revenge. It was about boundaries. Next, I quietly transferred the deed of my home into a living trust. If Vanessa had any plans of pushing me into a care facility and selling the property, as I suspected, that dream was now legally impossible without my explicit consent. I didn't tell David about any of this. Not yet. My plan required patience and timing. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt since Simon was alive. Control. Vanessa thought she had me cornered. She thought she could insult me, erase me, and walk away without consequence. But the chessboard had shifted, and I had just made the first move, and it was far from my last. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when I heard the knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. My first thought was that it might be a delivery. But when I opened it, I froze. David was standing on my porch. He looked different, older, tired, and somehow smaller than I remembered. His once perfect hair was unkempt, and the confident smile I used to know had been replaced by something uncertain. "Hi, Mom," he said softly. "Can I come in?" I hesitated longer than I should have. Part of me wanted to slam the door. Another part, the part that still remembered the boy who used to run into my arms after school, wanted to pull him into a hug. I stepped aside. We sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd once packed his lunches and helped him with homework. The silence between us was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the old wall clock. "Vanessa thinks we should talk," he began. "She's worried about you, about how distant you've been." I almost laughed. Worried about me? The woman who poured wine over my head was worried now? But I kept my face calm. "I needed space," I said quietly. "It's been a lot," he shifted uncomfortably. "She didn't mean for things to get out of hand. You know how she is. She just speaks her mind. Humiliating me in front of a room full of people isn't speaking her mind, David." His eyes darted to the floor. "I know, and I'm sorry. But I think if we all sat down together, we could move past this." There it was. The same avoidance, the same refusal to take a stand. He wasn't here because he wanted to make things right. He was here because she told him to. "I'm open to talking," I said finally, folding my hands on the table. "But I won't pretend nothing happened. And I won't let anyone treat me like that again." He nodded, but I saw the flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He wasn't used to hearing boundaries from me, and this was just the beginning. A week after David's visit, I received another invitation, this time to a family reconciliation dinner. The message was carefully worded, almost too careful. "Let's put the past behind us," it read. "Vanessa and I want to make things right." I stared at the text for a long time. Every instinct in me screamed that this wasn't about reconciliation. Vanessa had never apologized, never even acknowledged what she'd done. Why would she suddenly want peace now? Still, part of me needed to see it through. If they were planning something, I wanted to know what, and I wanted to be ready. I arrived 15 minutes early again, but this time I was prepared. I had my phone fully charged and a small voice recorder tucked into my purse. It wasn't paranoia, it was caution. I had learned the hard way that Vanessa's kindness always came with a price. The moment I walked in, I knew I was right. The atmosphere wasn't warm or welcoming. It was staged. Vanessa was seated at the head of the table, dressed in an immaculate white dress that made her look almost saintly. David was beside her, stiff and uncomfortable. Across from them sat a woman I didn't recognize. Sharp suit, neat hair, and a stack of papers. "Mom," David said, forcing a smile. "This is Dr. Patel, a family counselor. We thought she could help us. Talk things through, counselor, of course." This wasn't an apology. It was an ambush. Dr. Patel began politely enough, asking questions about how I'd been feeling since the incident. But before long, the tone shifted. Vanessa spoke about my erratic behavior, how I'd overreacted and isolated myself. David added that he was worried about my mental state. I sat silently, letting them talk, recording every word. They thought they were setting a trap, painting me as unstable so they could push me out of their lives permanently. But they had no idea that for the first time, I wasn't the prey in this story. I was the hunter. And their words would soon become the evidence that turned the tables completely. 2 days after that so-called reconciliation dinner, I sat at my kitchen table listening to the recording. My hands trembled slightly, but not from anger, from anticipation. The words Vanessa and David had said so confidently now existed as undeniable proof. They had called me unstable, erratic, and a risk. All the language designed to build a legal case for control, but that wasn't all. There was one moment in the recording I hadn't caught clearly at the table. Vanessa's voice, low and deliberate. If we can get her evaluated, we can manage her affairs before the will gets complicated. Those words confirmed what I had suspected for months. This wasn't about healing a family. It was about money. My home, my savings, the trust. They wanted it all. I decided to dig deeper. I started quietly speaking to people who had been close to Vanessa. Neighbors, mutual acquaintances, even one of her former co-workers. Most were hesitant to talk, but one, a woman named Erica, who had worked with Vanessa at a marketing firm, was more than willing. "She talks more than she should after a few drinks," Erica said over coffee. "I've heard her brag about how she's going to secure the future by convincing David to put you in assisted living. She even joked that the house would make a great down payment on a vacation property." It was everything I needed to hear, but Erica wasn't done. "There's more," she added. "She's been calling lawyers. She wants to challenge the terms of your will. Says she's worried you'll change your mind about leaving everything to David." I felt a strange calm settle over me. Vanessa's arrogance had become her weakness. She believed no one would ever question her, least of all me. But now I had witnesses. I had recordings. I had proof that her motives were financial and malicious, and with every piece of evidence I gathered, I was no longer the woman who had wine poured on her head. I was becoming the woman who would make Vanessa answer for every cruel word she had ever spoken. The more evidence I collected, the clearer my next move became. Vanessa's greed wasn't just her weakness, it was her addiction. And if I wanted to expose her, all I had to do was offer her exactly what she wanted, and watch her take the bait. With Lila's help, I began restructuring my finances, not in reality, but on paper. We drafted a provisional estate plan, a legal document that appeared to leave a significant portion of my estate directly to David and Vanessa, with a clause that could be activated upon my voluntary relocation to a care facility. The document was completely legal, but crucially, non-binding unless I signed it in the presence of witnesses. I then let a carefully placed rumor slip through Erica, the former co-worker who had overheard Vanessa's boasts. Over lunch, I casually mentioned that I was rethinking my will and considering options to make things easier for David and Vanessa. I knew the words would find their way back to her within 24 hours. They did. A week later, David showed up at my door again, this time with Vanessa. Her demeanor had changed entirely. Gone was the haughty sneer, replaced by a sugary sweet smile. "Grace," she said warmly, "we've been thinking about how we can support you more. Maybe help you transition into a place where you'll have company and medical care? We'd handle all the paperwork. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing." I almost laughed at the transparency. "That's very thoughtful," I said calmly. "In fact, I've been considering some documents myself. Perhaps we should review them together soon." Her eyes lit up. She thought she was winning. She thought she was finally bending me to her will. But what she didn't know was that every offer, every suggestion, every attempt to help was being documented, and that provisional estate plan would soon become Exhibit A in proving her intent to manipulate and exploit me. Vanessa believed she was walking me into her trap. But I had just closed mine around her. If Vanessa's greatest strength was manipulation behind closed doors, then her greatest vulnerability was her reputation in public. Everything she did, every expensive party, every carefully crafted social media post, every condescending comment, was designed to uphold an image. And I knew that if I shattered that image in front of the same people she had used to humiliate me, the damage would be irreversible. So I began to plan. First, I quietly contacted the Springwood Women's Association, a respected social circle Vanessa was desperate to join. They were hosting their annual charity gala, a highly publicized event attended by local business leaders, media, and donors. I had been a member for decades, and my late husband's contributions had earned me a lifetime seat on the board. Vanessa had no idea. Then, I made a few strategic phone calls. I offered to sponsor a scholarship in Simon's name, which secured me a prime speaking slot during the event. More importantly, I arranged for a legal representative, Lila, to attend as my guest. The same Lila who had the amended estate documents and copies of the recordings. On the night of the gala, Vanessa arrived in a glittering gown, her smile wide and confident. I could almost hear the gears in her head turning as she pictured herself networking, charming, elevating her social status. She didn't expect me to be there, and when she saw me standing on the stage, microphone in hand, her face drained of color. I spoke not of betrayal, but of values, the importance of integrity, of family, of protecting elders from exploitation. I never mentioned Vanessa by name, but every word was an arrow aimed straight at her carefully curated facade. By then, the filings were signed and stamped. All that remained was to serve them where spin couldn't survive the light. As I spoke, Lila quietly handed out envelopes to several board members, sealed summaries of Vanessa's words, plans, and financial schemes. The woman who had once mocked my humble background was about to watch her social empire crumble, and the best part? I didn't have to raise my voice or seek revenge. All I had to do was tell the truth, and let the truth do the destroying. The moment I stepped off the stage, the atmosphere in the grand ballroom shifted. Conversations had turned from polite chatter to whispers. Guests leaned close to one another, murmuring behind champagne glasses. And in the center of it all, Vanessa stood frozen, her flawless social mask cracking under the weight of suspicion. It didn't take long for her to come storming toward me. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she hissed, gripping my arm with nails like talons. "Are you trying to embarrass me?" I looked at her, calm, steady, unflinching. "Embarrass you? No, Vanessa. I'm simply telling the truth." She glanced around nervously. Several board members were already reading the contents of the envelopes Lila had distributed. Faces that had once looked at her with admiration now stared with skepticism and disgust. "You planned this," she spat, lowering her voice. "You set me up." "I didn't have to," I replied. "You did that to yourself the day you decided I wasn't worthy of respect." Her composure faltered. "You think anyone will believe a bitter old woman over me? I'm family now." "Family?" I repeated, smiling sadly. "Family doesn't plot to isolate an elderly widow, siphon her inheritance, and drive her out of her own home. Family doesn't call her trash behind closed doors." Her eyes widened. "Yes, Vanessa," I interrupted quietly. "I know everything, and so do they." Right on cue, Lila approached with a folder. "Ms. Carnegie," she said to Vanessa, "you've been served. These are formal legal proceedings regarding attempted financial abuse and coercion." The blood drained from Vanessa's face. Around us, the murmurs grew louder. A photographer snapped a picture just as Vanessa stumbled backward, clutching the papers with trembling hands. In one night, in one carefully orchestrated moment, her empire of manipulation collapsed. And for the first time since she poured that wine over my head, I was the one standing tall while she was the one shrinking away in shame. The gala hall had turned into a courtroom of whispers. Everywhere Vanessa turned, there were eyes. Once warm and admiring, now cold and judgmental. The queen of pretension, the self-proclaimed perfect daughter-in-law, was unraveling in real time, and there was no script she could follow to save herself. "Everyone, please, this is all a misunderstanding," she called out, forcing a laugh that sounded more like a gasp. "She's confused. My mother-in-law isn't well. She's been manipulated." But the room was not convinced. A woman from the board, Nora, who had known me for over 20 years, stood up and spoke clearly, her voice slicing through Vanessa's desperate pleas. "Manipulated?" I've read the evidence, and I've heard the recordings. You tried to convince David to cut his own mother out of her home. You mocked her for being too poor to belong in your circle, and you plotted to sell the house she built with her late husband. Tell me, Vanessa, is that a misunderstanding? A ripple of gasps swept through the crowd. Vanessa's lips trembled. I was only thinking of what was best for the family. Best for the family? Another board member said sharply. Or best for your bank account? With every word, the fortress of lies she'd built around herself crumbled. Donors pulled back. Invitations were rescinded right there in front of everyone. One by one, people stepped away from her, physically and symbolically distancing themselves from the woman they had once embraced. Finally, David arrived. He had heard the rumors, and now, with the legal notice in his hands and the shameful evidence on display, he stared at his wife as if he were seeing her for the first time. "Vanessa," he said softly, "tell me this isn't true." She opened her mouth, but no words came. No excuses, no rehearsed lines. In that moment, under the chandeliers, under the eyes of everyone she had sought to impress, Vanessa fell from grace, and I didn't have to raise a hand. All I had to do was stand in my truth and watch karma finish the job. Vanessa was shaking. The woman who once strutted into every room with her chin high and her smile rehearsed now looked like a trapped animal, darting glances toward the exits as if she could flee from the consequences closing in on her. But there was no escape, not this time. "David, please," she whispered, reaching for his hand, but he pulled away, his face unreadable. "Tell me the truth," he demanded, his voice trembling, not with anger, but with heartbreak. "Did you really say my mother didn't belong here? Did you mock her behind my back? Did you try to take her home from her?" Her lips parted, searching for a lie to climb out of, but none came. The silence between them was heavier than any confession. "Yes," I said quietly before she could speak. "She did all of it, and more." Lila stepped forward again, handing David a thin stack of papers, copies of transactions. Vanessa had secretly arranged to transfer my property into a joint account under her name and his. "She planned to sell the house without your consent," Lila explained. "She even met with a realtor last month. It's all documented." David's face drained of color. You were going to sell the home I grew up in?" "It was for us," she stammered. "For our future." "No," he said, stepping back. "It was for you." The room went silent. The music had stopped, the waiters had retreated, and every guest stood frozen, watching the implosion of a marriage and an ego at the same time. Then Nora, ever the voice of reason, spoke once more. "Vanessa Carnegie," Nora said, "the chairwoman of the Springwood Women's Association, I am formally rescinding your membership, effective immediately." Her world, the social throne she had clawed and schemed for, collapsed with those words. And this time, there was no wineglass to hide behind, no cruel smirk to cover the shame. The mask she had worn for so long slipped completely. And standing before everyone, Vanessa wasn't a queen anymore. She was just a woman, exposed, disgraced, and powerless. The silence that followed Nora's announcement was almost unbearable. You could hear the faint clink of a champagne glass somewhere in the back of the room, the distant hum of the city beyond the ballroom windows. But between David and Vanessa, there was nothing but the sound of a life breaking apart. David stared at his wife as if she were a stranger, the man who once adored her, who defended her against whispers, who believed every tear she shed, now saw the truth written plainly across her trembling face. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice hoarse. "Why would you do this? Why would you treat my mother, like she's beneath you?" Vanessa's lower lip quivered. "I just wanted us to have a better life. A better future. That house, that neighborhood, it's all so outdated. We deserve more." David's jaw tightened. "We had more. We had love. We had trust. And you destroyed it for greed and appearances." She stepped toward him, desperation in her eyes. "David, please. I made mistakes. I can fix this. We can fix this. I love you." He shook his head slowly. "Love?" he repeated bitterly. "If this is love, I don't want it." He turned to me, his voice softening. Mom, I am so sorry. For not seeing it sooner. For letting it get this far. I nodded, the weight of his words both healing and heartbreaking. You were blinded by love, son. But now your eyes are open. David turned back to Vanessa. I can't stay married to someone who humiliates my family, who plots behind my back, who disrespects the woman who gave me everything. We're done, Vanessa. I'm filing for divorce. The word hung in the air like a final verdict. Vanessa's knees buckled slightly and she reached out for his hand, but he stepped away. In that moment, the last thread connecting her to this family, to the life she had schemed so hard to control, snapped. Her power was gone. And my son had finally chosen love and loyalty over lies and appearances. Vanessa's downfall didn't end with David's decision to leave her. In fact, that moment was just the beginning. Once the divorce papers were filed, the facade she had carefully built for years started to crumble, one layer at a time. And this time, I wasn't just watching from the sidelines. I knew her greatest weapon had always been perception. She thrived on appearances, the perfect wife, the sophisticated hostess, the woman who saved David from his small-town roots. So I decided to dismantle that illusion piece by piece. It started quietly. At church on Sunday, I spoke softly with a few longtime neighbors. I never thought I'd see the day someone poured wine over me and laughed, I said with a sad smile. But I suppose money and arrogance change people. Their eyes widened. By the following Wednesday, the story had spread across the congregation like wildfire. By the end of the week, invitations that once flowed to Vanessa stopped arriving. The Women's Charity Board, the one she boasted about, asked her to step down temporarily. Even the boutique where she held her luncheons refused to host her events. Then came the article. A local columnist who had attended the gala wrote a biting piece titled, "When Money Isn't Class." It recounted the humiliation I suffered in front of dozens of witnesses. The piece didn't mention Vanessa by name, but everyone in town knew exactly who it was about. Vanessa tried to fight back. She called me, begging for a meeting. "Please," she said through tears, "they're turning against me." I didn't mean for it to go this far. I listened quietly. I didn't mean for my son to grow up ashamed of his own mother either, I replied. But here we are. Every rumor, every whisper, every withdrawn invitation chipped away at the image she valued more than love itself. She had once poured wine over me to remind me I didn't belong. Now, society itself was telling her she didn't belong. Not in my son's life, not in our family, not even in the town she had tried to conquer. Humiliation was something Vanessa had never tasted before. And once the town turned its back on her, she became desperate to claw back control. But desperation makes people reckless, and that recklessness was about to become her undoing. 2 weeks after David filed for divorce, I received a call from our family lawyer, Mr. Bennett. "Mrs. Holloway," he said gravely, "I think you should come into my office. Vanessa is challenging the terms of David's separation, and she's naming you in her claims." "Me?" I asked, stunned. "She's alleging that you poisoned their marriage. She's claiming emotional harassment, defamation, and interference with marital finances. She's trying to sue you for damages." I almost laughed. The same woman who poured wine over my head in front of 200 people now painted herself as the victim. But I didn't panic, because I knew something she didn't. Weeks before the gala, I had begun keeping detailed records of everything, every text message, every voicemail, every snide remark made in public, every insult she hurled my way. And thanks to Nora, there were dozens of photographs and videos of that humiliating night, proof that she had crossed the line. Not me. At the hearing, Vanessa strode in wearing her usual designer suit and icy expression. She spoke eloquently about how I had alienated her from David and undermined her role as a wife. But then Mr. Bennett rose, calm and deliberate, and presented a stack of evidence taller than a law textbook. Video clips of the gala. Eyewitness statements. Her drunken voice on a voicemail saying, "I'll make sure that old woman never sets foot in my house again." Her face turned white. The judge looked unimpressed. "Ms. Carnegie," he said, "from the evidence presented, it appears you were the aggressor, not the victim. I'm dismissing this case with prejudice." Not only was her lawsuit thrown out, but the judge ordered her to pay my legal fees. In trying to destroy me legally, Vanessa had only exposed herself further, and now, even the courts were on my side. It was the turning point I had been waiting for. The trap she set for me had closed around her instead. After her lawsuit collapsed, Vanessa disappeared from public view for a while. The once flashy socialite stopped attending charity galas and avoided grocery stores where she might bump into familiar faces. But I knew it wasn't over, not yet, because people like Vanessa never surrender quietly. They plot, they scheme, they grasp for one last lifeline. And sure enough, that lifeline came in the form of David's assets. One chilly Monday morning, David showed up at my door with a thick envelope in his hand and worry on his face. "Mom," he said, sitting heavily on the couch, "Vanessa's trying to drain our joint accounts before the divorce is finalized. She's already transferred over $80,000 to an account I've never seen before." I took a slow, steady breath. "Do you have proof?" He nodded. "I contacted the bank. They confirmed the transfers and traced them to a shell company registered in her cousin's name. She's trying to hide the money. This was more than greed, it was fraud. And with David's legal team already prepared, we decided to act swiftly. Mr. Bennett filed a motion with the court to freeze all joint assets pending a full financial audit. Within 48 hours, every account Vanessa could touch was locked tight. But the real bombshell came when the forensic accountant dug deeper. Vanessa had been siphoning money for months, small withdrawals here and there, totaling over $250,000, to fund a lavish lifestyle she had been hiding from David. Luxury handbags, private spa memberships, and even a secret property listed under her maiden name in another city. When confronted, she broke. "I just wanted security," she shouted in court, tears streaking her mascara. "I knew he'd leave me eventually, and I wasn't going to end up with nothing." The judge was unmoved. "You attempted to conceal marital assets. That is fraud. This will significantly impact your settlement." In the final ruling, Vanessa forfeited her claim to the marital home and received only a fraction of what she had expected, barely enough to start over. Her plan to secure wealth ended with her losing nearly everything. And for the first time, I saw in her eyes the thing she feared most: powerlessness. By the time the financial investigation ended, Vanessa was a shadow of the woman she used to be. The confident smirk, the designer outfits, the air of superiority, all of it had faded into a bitter mix of panic and desperation. But the final blow, the one that would strip away the last shred of her power, was still to come. In the months after the gala, the legal battle that followed was swift and decisive. With the fraud exposed and the harassment documented, the divorce settlement favored David almost entirely. The judge awarded him full ownership of their home, sole custody of their daughter Lily, who had become increasingly withdrawn during the chaos, and primary control of their joint investments. Vanessa walked away with nothing but a modest alimony, a fraction of what she had demanded. In court, she looked like a ghost of herself. Gone was the woman who once sneered at my second-hand clothes and mocked my modest life. She didn't look at me, didn't speak, didn't even defend herself when the evidence was presented. And when the judge read the final verdict, she quietly wept into her hands. After the hearing, David turned to me in the hallway, his eyes soft but resolute. "Mom," he said, voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you. If it weren't for you, I might still be trapped in that nightmare, blind to what she really was." I touched his arm gently. "No, son. You opened your own eyes. I just made sure you had the light." Vanessa left the courthouse without a word. Rumors swirled that she had moved back in with her parents in another town, too ashamed to face anyone in Westbridge again. The once envied socialite was now a cautionary tale, a whispered warning about arrogance, greed, and cruelty. And as for me? My life didn't return to the way it was before. It grew quieter, simpler, stronger. The storm had passed, and in its place was a peace I hadn't known in years. The weeks after the court's decision felt like watching spring slowly return after a brutal winter. The air in my home was lighter. The silences that once hung heavy between David and me, filled with unspoken disappointment and confusion, were now replaced with real conversations, shared meals, and small, tender moments that had been missing for far too long. One Sunday afternoon, David arrived with Lily, her small hand clutching his as they walked up my garden path. She was only 7, but the ordeal had left its mark. She clung to him a little tighter now, asked more questions than most children her age, and watched adults with careful eyes. "Grandma!" she cried as soon as she saw me. She ran into my arms, burying her face against my chest. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed the sound of her little voice until that moment. We spent the afternoon baking cookies, planting flowers, and reading stories. For the first time she laughed, a full, unguarded laugh, and David and I exchanged a glance that said everything. Healing had begun. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon and Lily dozed on the couch, David sat with me on the porch, sipping tea. "I don't know how I let it get this bad," he said quietly. "How I didn't see how she treated you, how she treated us." "Love blinds us," I said gently, "but it also teaches us. You're not the man you were a year ago, and neither am I." He nodded. "I want Lily to grow up surrounded by love, real love. I want her to know her grandmother, to see the strength you've shown. You're part of her story, Mom, always." Tears welled in my eyes, but they weren't from pain this time. They were from gratitude, for second chances, for healing, for the unbreakable bond between a mother and her son. The family Vanessa had tried so hard to break apart was not just intact, it was stronger than ever. And this time, we were building it on a foundation that no amount of arrogance or cruelty could shake. It was a quiet Thursday morning when the knock came. Soft, hesitant, almost apologetic. I wasn't expecting anyone. David was at work, Lily at school, and my small house was wrapped in the comforting silence of a life finally free from turmoil. When I opened the door, I froze. There, standing on my porch in a plain gray coat and worn shoes, was Vanessa. Her once perfect hair was unkempt, her eyes rimmed with dark circles. She looked smaller, diminished, as if the weight of her choices had physically pressed her down. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For a long moment, I said nothing. A part of me wanted to slam the door. Another part, the part that still remembered the girl David had once loved, told me to listen. I stepped aside. She walked into my living room like a stranger entering a sacred space, glancing at the family photos on the wall, the ones she had once mocked as outdated, with a reverence that surprised me. "I don't expect forgiveness," she began, her voice trembling. "I know I don't deserve it. I ruined everything, my marriage, my family, my reputation. But most of all, I hurt you. And I can't stop thinking about that night. The wine, the words. The look on your face," tears welled in her eyes. "I was cruel. I was shallow. I thought I was better than you, but I was wrong. You're stronger, wiser, and more loved than I ever was. I just needed to say I'm sorry, truly sorry." I studied her carefully. Part of me still remembered the humiliation, the sting of her words, the laughter of the crowd. But I also saw something I had never seen before: sincerity. "I accept your apology," I said softly. "But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. Our lives have gone separate ways, and that's how it must stay." Vanessa nodded, tears streaming freely now. "I understand," she whispered. "Thank you for hearing me." As she walked away, I felt no anger, only a quiet peace. Justice had been served. The past was behind me, and I was free. Months passed after Vanessa's unexpected visit, and though her apology lingered in my memory, I rarely thought of her anymore. My life had moved on, not in a dramatic, triumphant way, but in small, steady steps toward peace. It was David's idea to start the Matriarchs Fund, a charitable initiative supporting single mothers and elderly women struggling with housing and dignity in our town. "Mom," he said one evening over dinner, "what you went through shouldn't happen to anyone. Let's turn that pain into something powerful." The idea took root quickly. Soon we were working with local organizations, raising funds and planning community events. When the first annual fundraiser was announced, the committee insisted that I be the guest of honor. At first I resisted. I wasn't used to the spotlight. But then I thought of that night at the gala, when wine dripped from my hair and laughter echoed around me. If I had endured that humiliation, I could certainly stand in front of a crowd now. The night of the fundraiser was nothing short of magical. The same ballroom where I had once been publicly humiliated was now decorated with fresh flowers and banners bearing the foundation's name. Hundreds of people gathered, local leaders, families we'd helped, neighbors, even strangers who had heard my story and wanted to be part of something good. When I stepped up to the microphone, my heart swelled. "A few years ago," I began, "I was told I didn't belong here. But the truth is, we all belong wherever there is kindness, justice, and love. Tonight is not about revenge, it's about resilience. It's about turning the worst chapters of our lives into seeds for something better." The room erupted into applause. I caught David wiping away a tear, and even little Lily clapped proudly from the front row. As the evening went on, donations poured in, far beyond our expectations. That night, we raised enough to help dozens of families. In that moment, I realized my story was no longer about humiliation or betrayal. It was about strength, about legacy, about rising and helping others rise with me. It was a warm spring morning when I decided to visit the old country inn, the same place where everything had fallen apart years ago. I hadn't stepped foot there since the night Vanessa poured wine over my head and told me I didn't belong. For years, the memory of that humiliation haunted me like a stain I couldn't wash away. But now, I was different. I was stronger. I wanted to face that place not as the woman who left in tears, but as the woman who rose from them. The inn hadn't changed much, the same ivy climbing its stone walls, the same fountain bubbling in the courtyard, the same polished oak doors. But as I walked inside, it felt smaller somehow. Or maybe it was just that I had grown. I asked the maitre d' if I could sit at the corner table by the window, the very spot where I had once sat, humiliated and trembling. He smiled warmly and led me there. As I settled into the chair, memories washed over me. The splash of cold wine, the laughter that had pierced my heart, the voice in my head whispering, "You don't belong." This time, there was no pain. Only perspective. I ordered tea and watched the world go by outside the window. Couples strolled hand in hand, children played near the fountain, and life, beautiful, ordinary life, went on. David called while I was there. "Mom, where are you?" "At the inn," I said with a small smile. A pause, then softly, "Are you okay?" "Better than okay," I replied. "I'm rewriting the ending." When I left, I walked slowly through the courtyard, pausing by the fountain. I took a deep breath and whispered to the wind, "I do belong. I always did." For the first time since that awful night, the place no longer held power over me. It was just a building, and I was no longer its victim. I was its survivor, its conqueror, its victor. 2 years passed after the divorce. 2 years of quiet healing, steady rebuilding, and rediscovering what it meant to live without tension hanging over every family gathering. Life found a new rhythm, one that was slower, gentler, and infinitely more meaningful. David changed the most. The man who once walked on eggshells to keep the peace was now grounded and confident, a devoted single father whose priorities were crystal clear. His relationship with Lily blossomed. Every weekend was a new adventure, from hiking trips and cooking experiments to quiet afternoons spent reading together. And I was part of it all. One evening, they invited me over for dinner. Lily, now 9, insisted on helping cook. She wore a tiny apron and flour on her cheeks, proudly announcing that she had made the mashed potatoes all by herself. David and I exchanged a glance, simple, but full of unspoken gratitude. During dinner, Lily suddenly looked up from her plate. "Grandma," she said, "Dad says you're the bravest person he knows." I chuckled softly. "Does he now?" David smiled. "It's true, Mom. You taught me what real strength looks like. You didn't just fight back. You showed me how to build something better after the storm. After we ate, we sat on the porch as the sun set over the neighborhood. David told me he had started seeing someone, a kind, grounded woman named Maya who worked as a teacher. They were taking things slowly, but he felt hopeful. "I'm not rushing anything," he said. "I just want to do it right this time. I want a life built on respect and partnership, the way you and Dad always had." Hearing that warmed me more than I could say. As fireflies danced in the twilight, I realized something beautiful. Our family hadn't just survived. It had grown. The pain had forged stronger bonds, deeper love, and a clearer understanding of what truly mattered. The storm Vanessa brought into our lives was long gone. In its place stood a family reborn, scarred, yes, but stronger, wiser, and more unbreakable than ever. It was a rainy afternoon when the past found its way back to my doorstep. I was sorting through the mail, bills, a gardening magazine, a card from an old friend, when I saw it, a plain white envelope with no return address, written in handwriting I hadn't seen in years. Vanessa. For a moment, I considered throwing it away unopened. The chapter felt closed. I had no interest in reopening old wounds. But something, curiosity perhaps, or the faint hope of closure, made me sit down at the kitchen table and carefully tear it open. The letter inside was short, handwritten and trembling with regret. "Dear Grace Holloway, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I needed to write it. It's been 2 years since I lost everything. My marriage, my family, my reputation. And every day since then has been a lesson I wish I had learned sooner. I live a quiet life now. I rent a small apartment in another city and work part-time at a local library. It's nothing like the glamorous life I once chased, but in a strange way, it's more peaceful. And with every passing day, I see more clearly how wrong I was. I thought money and appearances made me worthy. I thought power meant control. But you showed me, painfully but clearly, that dignity, respect, and love are the only things that matter. I destroyed them with my arrogance, and for that I will always be sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope that one day when Lily asks about me, you'll tell her I was human, deeply flawed but capable of regret. Thank you for teaching me, even through your pain." Vanessa folded the letter slowly, my chest heavy with complicated emotion. There was no anger left, no bitterness, just a quiet sadness and a strange sense of closure. Vanessa had once been the storm that nearly shattered our family. Now she was a distant echo of who she used to be, a warning, a lesson, and perhaps in some small way a changed soul. I tucked the letter into a box with other memories, not as a wound, but as proof of how far we had come. As time moved gently forward, the scars of the past faded into stories, lessons I carried not as burdens, but as pieces of wisdom to pass on. I had spent so many years reacting to cruelty, proving my worth, and defending my dignity. Now I wanted to teach the next generation to live without ever needing to fight for those things in the first place. One afternoon, Lily and I were baking cookies in my kitchen, a tradition we'd started after the divorce and kept alive every month. The smell of cinnamon filled the air, and sunlight spilled across the counter as she worked carefully beside me, flour dusting her nose and cheeks. "Grandma," she said suddenly, looking up at me with those curious, searching eyes, "why don't we talk about my mom?" The question caught me off guard. I wiped my hands on a towel and sat beside her. "Because some stories are heavy," I said gently, "and I wanted you to grow a little before I shared them." She thought about that for a moment. "Did she hurt you?" "Yes," I admitted, meeting her gaze. "She did. But more importantly, she hurt herself. She forgot that kindness matters more than money, that people are more valuable than things. And when you forget that, you lose everything that truly matters." Lily nodded slowly, processing my words. "I don't want to forget that." I smiled, brushing a stray curl from her face. "And you won't, because you'll grow up surrounded by people who love you, people who will remind you that love is measured by how we treat others, not by how much we own." That moment, simple, tender, honest, was everything I had fought for. It was why I had endured humiliation, why I had pursued justice, why I had chosen to rise instead of retreat. The greatest revenge, I realized, isn't just justice served. It's teaching the next generation never to repeat the same mistakes. Lily grinned. I'm going to be just like you, Grandma. I laughed softly. I hope you're even better. 5 years had passed since that humiliating night when wine dripped from my hair and laughter followed me out of a room I was told I didn't belong in. 5 years since betrayal carved its deep scars into our family story. And yet, as I sat on my porch watching the evening sun melt into gold and rose above the horizon, I realized something profound. Those scars had healed into strength. The life I lived now was quiet, but it was full of laughter that echoed through Sunday dinners, full of tiny handprints on my kitchen walls from Lily's endless curiosity, full of peace that no one could ever take from me again. Every so often, people in town still whispered about that scandal. But the whispers had changed tone. Once they were laced with pity, now they were filled with respect. My story had become more than gossip. It had become a lesson. One afternoon, a young woman stopped me outside the market. Mrs. Holloway? She asked shyly. I heard you speak at the Empowerment Forum last year. I was in a toxic relationship, and your story gave me the courage to walk away. Her words warmed me more than she could know. That was the real legacy, not the revenge, not the justice, not even the redemption. It was the ripple effect of truth, dignity, and resilience. As I watered the roses in my garden later that evening, the ones David and Lily planted for my birthday, I whispered a silent thank you to the woman I used to be. The one who cried herself to sleep after being humiliated. The one who nearly broke under the weight of betrayal, but chose to rise instead. I once believed revenge was the ultimate victory. But now I understood. Justice is the victory, peace is the reward, and strength is the legacy. I forgave Vanessa, not because she deserved it, but because I deserved freedom from the anger. And though reconciliation would never come, I had something far better, a life defined not by what was done to me, but by how I chose to rise above it. And that, I realized, is the truest form of power. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it. If you have a unique story of your own, share it in the comments below. Thank you for listening.